Well, hello again, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the MIT Internet Policy Research Initiative and CSAIL Computing and Society Community of Research core workshop on democracy, disinformation, AI, and platform regulation. On behalf of my fellow organizers, Hal Abelson, David Clark, David Edelman, Una Mae O'Reilly, and Taylor Reynolds. We're really delighted that you can all be here. My name is Danny Weitzner. I'm the director of the MIT Internet Policy Research Initiative. And I'm going to just get us kicked off here, talk a little bit about our goals and how we're going to proceed. So we have a fantastic group of speakers from a variety of disciplines, computer science, public policy, and social science. And they're going to help us explore three questions over the next 2 hours. First, how online platforms affect democratic values, including the negative impact of disinformation. How technology, operational, and public policy levers can enhance or detract from these democratic values. And most practically, what the computer science community can contribute to these pressing questions. I'll get to some logistics right before we turn it over to the first panel, but I want to start with just a little bit of background on the public policy framework that governs the online platforms that we're here to discuss. I'll say as a caveat, my discussion here is going to be somewhat US-centric, but it describes a policy model that is similar to many other democratic countries around the world. It's certainly not a model that's followed by China or Russia or other authoritarian regimes. And probably most importantly, the policy framework that I'm describing is under review and under pressure, really, by countries all around the world. So that's part of what makes this discussion so timely. I want to just talk about the groundwork that was laid 30 years ago and from a public policy perspective and what has shaped the environment that we have today. Number one, that groundwork is defined by a very strong commitment to free speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. In 1997, the United States Supreme Court granted speech on the internet the highest possible level of protection. And it did that recognizing what it saw as the great democratic potential of this then new medium, the internet and the World Wide Web and other digital fora, in which anyone could reach out to others around the country and around the world with remarkably low barriers to entry, remarkably low barriers to speech and to receiving information. And this was viewed by the Supreme Court as a very positive characteristic, which it sought to protect through strong free speech protections. Secondly, the Supreme Court, in extending this protection, chose to rely on individual user control, user choice, as opposed to government censorship, as a way to address the inevitable, objectionable, and harmful content that might appear online. So the view at the time in the 1990s was that it would be better for individuals to make choices about what content they wanted to see and what they didn't want to see, as opposed to having governments make those kinds of choices. Second key foundation of the internet platforms that we're discussing today is a set of baseline rules about how these platforms, what we now know as Google, Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, many others, that Congress actually sought to create a set of rules that governed the legal environment that these platforms would operate under. These rules are known now as Section 230 and subject to quite a bit of discussion. The goals of Section 230 were pretty clear at the time. The goal was to encourage the development of the widest possible number of internet platforms so that individuals could use these platforms as a way to speak. There was a recognition that while individual speech online was free and strongly protected as a legal matter, as a practical matter, we are all dependent on these platforms as a venue for our ability to actually exercise these free speech rights. And Section 230 sought to protect and encourage the growth of these platforms, and by extension, protect and encourage free speech with two key mechanisms. Number one, 230 sought to remove barriers to these platforms exercising editorial discretion so that they could filter out content that they considered harmful, that they think their audience might consider harmful, and that by saying that the platforms would not be responsible for the speech, the independently produced speech and content of their users. Now, again, this assumed at the time that there would be a large number of diverse platforms. And the idea was that each one could make decisions about what content it would allow and what content it would block. Secondly, 230 provided what has come to be called the Good Samaritan protections. Those are protections that immunize platforms from any legal liability that they for actions that they might take to remove content that they consider harmful. To take a contemporary example, the actions by Amazon, Google, and others in cutting off services to Parler just recently, earlier this month, are protected under Section 230. That is, it would be hard to sue Amazon or Google or others for those steps. We're here to look at the environment that this legal framework has produced for us today. Of course, the legal framework here is only one part of what has made online speech what it is today. There are numerous technical decisions made in the design of these platforms. There are numerous business decisions and operational decisions, and we'll look at some of those. But as a foundation, it's important to look at what are the policy rules that really govern all of this. I'm just going to make a couple of quick notes about logistics. By way of ground rules, number one, this event is open to the entire MIT community. It is being recorded, and we intend to make it public very soon after the event. We will not make public any of the chit chat in the chat room, so don't worry about that. But if you don't want your name used, please don't put it in the questions. There'll be a Q&A session at the end of each panel, and then one at the end of the entire workshop. We ask you to place questions into the Zoom interface using the Q&A feature. We encourage you to identify yourself if you like, but you don't have to. And the moderators will select questions from those that are put into the question and answer feature. So with that, thanks again for joining, and we will get started with our panel. It's my pleasure now to introduce my colleague, Dr. Uname O'Reilly, who's a principal investigator at CSAIL. She leads the ALFA, or AnyScale Learning for All group, and is a member of our Computing and Society community of research. So Uname, take it away. Look forward to your panel.
Well, hi, everyone. My deep interest is in adversarial behavior. I'm a computer scientist, and I have a background in artificial intelligence. So with my research group, I work on artificial adversarial intelligence. My interest started from taxation. It continues with network security, malware detection, and model attacks. And by using both data-driven machine learning and modeling and simulation, we try to understand adversarial behavior better and even address problematic types of it. So what brings me to this topic is fairly obvious. Disinformation is a widespread, powerful form of adversarial behavior. We experience it at a global level when climate change is doubted or public health information is distorted. We experience it on a political or national level when it impacts our elections. The questions that this workshop surfaces today are, how can we understand disinformation better by using a technological lens to inform policy? And how might the goals and capabilities of technology intersect with public discourse and policy around disinformation? So today, I welcome you in joining me to learn more about the technological bases of disinformation with this expert panel. I'm going to introduce all three of them together. They each have really extensive and impressive bios, but I'm just going to touch on a few things to allow them time to speak. So our first speaker is Professor Deb Roy of MIT's Media Lab, where he directs the MIT Center for Constructive Communication. Deb leads research in applied machine learning and human-machine interaction, and he designs systems for learning and constructive dialogue and mapping and analyzing large-scale media ecosystems. He is also co-founder and chair of Cortigo, a nonprofit social venture that is developing and operating the Local Voices Network that fosters constructive public conversation across political and cultural divides. He was co-founder and CEO of Bluefin Labs, a media analytics company that analyzed the interactions between television and social media at scale. And from 2013 to 2017, he served as Twitter's chief media scientist. He has MIT in common with all of us, and he shares a Canadian background with me. The second speaker will be Kathleen Carley. She's a professor of societal computing in the School of Computer Sciences Institute for Software Research at Carnegie Mellon University. She's also the director of the Center for Computational Analysis of Social and Organizational Systems and the director of the Center for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity. This latter center is CMU's Center for Disinformation, Hate Speech, and Extremism Online. She's also a CEO of Netonomics. So for us, I'll highlight that she has two undergraduate degrees from MIT. Her research interests include applying computational social science, cognitive science, organizational science, dynamic network analysis, social network analysis, ML, data analytics, and text analytics to complex social and organizational problems. She particularly focuses on social cybersecurity and disinformation. She and the centers she leads have developed really important infrastructure tools to help analyze large-scale dynamic networks and bot hunters. Finally, we're very privileged to have Professor Ethan Zuckerman join us today, fresh from a talk around his new book. It's entitled Mistrust: How Losing Faith in Institutions Provides the Tools to Transform Them. Ethan is a professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where he teaches public policy, communication, and information. At UMass, he's starting a new research center called the Institute for Digital Public Infrastructure. He was at MIT for a long time. Up to 2020, he was an associate professor of the practice of media arts and sciences at the Media Lab since 2016. And prior to that, he held an appointment jointly with comparative media studies and writing. Way back, he was a senior researcher at Harvard's Berkman Institute for Internet and Society. Ethan works on information dynamics on online platforms. He takes a broad multidisciplinary perspective. He studied online platforms in the developing world, and he knows a lot about related topics like quantitative analysis of media. So I've asked each speaker to prepare to talk for about 8 minutes. And after that, we'll split the remaining 20 minutes of this panel's time between a roundtable discussion where I'm anticipating speakers will have a lot to say to each other, and I'll kick that off with a few questions. And then we'll take questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Deb, who's going to kick us off.
Thank you, May, and really a pleasure to be here together with some old friends and all those people out there in Zoom land that we can't see. So in my 8 minutes, I thought I would just try to make a couple of points. One is to share a way that I started conceptualizing Twitter that I found helpful, and I hope some of you will as well, as a way to think not just about Twitter, but social media platforms in general, and then use that framing to make a couple of remarks about disinformation and sort of mitigation. The concept is what I call a social broadcast network. And the idea is that one way to look at the users or the clients of a social media platform like Facebook or Instagram or TikTok or YouTube and Twitter is that you have two kinds of users, social users, kind of us little people who are interested primarily in consuming, sharing, and commenting on content. And individual users can have broadcast moments where something they say or post gets a large audience, but that doesn't make someone a broadcaster. The broadcaster has a track record of reach through their content. Some old school broadcasters like Hannity and Maddow have made the transition. Others, maybe in public media, haven't. Kind of like Polaroid did not make it over, and Canon did. And then there are new broadcasters that emerge that are kind of platform specific. The platforms in general know who those broadcasters are. At Twitter, we used to call them very important tweeters. There are YouTubers, YouTube stars, et cetera. And the platform has a couple of functions. The network, it connects social users to one another and broadcasters through their network. And one interesting thing about all of these platforms is that decision-making logic for where a broadcast spreads is complex. It depends on individual decisions and platform algorithmic design and the nudges of the actual interface. So with this idea of a social broadcast network, if we think about sources or causes of disinformation at a social level, first of all, fundamentally, the fact that we have a fragmented universe, I think, is key to always keep in mind. That almost feels like a root cause where there are silos where information doesn't come into contact with certain groups. We, the people, tend to spread often false stuff. That we did some studies in the past and looking at the spread of false news. And there's at least hints that emotional responses to novel, disgusting news in our study was one of the reasons that people perhaps share what turn out to be false information in the moment. Social signaling and sometimes just purposeful bad behavior are all reasons for kind of the social clients. My colleague at Sloan, David Rand, has shown that actually most people don't want to share inaccurate information, but they're in a mindset where because of the space they're in, they do. Broadcasters, it's complicated. And by the way, broadcasters include both individual influencers and organizations that have the sort of sustained broadcast reach. One of the problems with disinformation is that opinion blurs into fact and sort of factual statements. So it's very difficult to draw a clear line in where opinion is fact. It's in general, I think it's profitable to divide and to divide an audience and then enrage. So if division and enragement is a profitable approach for a broadcaster, it's difficult to figure out incentives at the broadcast level. So as Les Moonves, the CEO at the time of CBS, famously said during the rise of Donald Trump in the primaries, how do you feel about what's happening? And his answer was bad for the country, but great for business. And that he's not alone in having that, that sort of perspective. And then you have politically motivated broadcasters, and then you have what you might call public sphere vandals. So various incentives behind the broadcast. And then if you go to the platform, the operators, the big companies now, I think there's a long lineage from MySpace to Facebook to YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Most of these fit this category where the norms that were set in the sort of initial days of the platform of what kind of behavior is expected. It was kind of within the parameters of what the platform allows, anything goes as long as it's not illegal. And once you have that, and you can contrast it with LinkedIn as a strong counterexample where there was a much more of a clear stated purpose. when anything goes, that will of course bring in bad behavior. If the AI that powers decisions for what content gets propagated further is picking up on and amplifying subconscious preferences of large numbers of people, and that is also profitable for the platform, it becomes a sort of difficult dynamic in terms of the disinformation that is primarily, I believe, being sourced by the broadcasters. So what can we do to limit harms? I kind of, again, go through these three categories. At the social level, we can design nudges into the platforms. Actually, David Rand, once again, has done some interesting work as just one example. I think there are limits to changing the design of the platforms to really limit in a widespread way individual sort of social behavior of sharing, because if it cuts into the commercial interests of the platform, you sort of hit a point of tension. We could imagine designing social campaigns totally outside of the technology. The designated driver program, for example, had widespread influence. So what does the equivalent look like? Although there's limits on the social platforms because of anonymity and other things. I think broadcasters actually is the hardest place to directly think of ways to mitigate the behavior, because it's just, as long as you can operate in a fragmented space and benefit, I guess my imagination sort of runs dry there. On the platforms, the network operators, first of all, although there's a lot that can be debated about quality of content and how to define disinformation or misinformation, in practice, there are working definitions. So, you know, Google News will not return results from all of the internet. They have actually internally a curated list of what they consider legitimate news sources. Facebook flexed its muscle soon after the election, where for a couple of days it dialed down low quality sources and then dialed them back up. So self-regulation, I think, at least in some basic ways of limiting the flow of low quality, high disinformation content, broadcast sources is in practice already achievable, but it's difficult to balance with commercial goals of the platforms. Government pressure is possible, again, with that pragmatic framing as a starting point. Although if you have, to the degree to which there's a preference for party over, let's say, healthy pluralistic democracy amongst the government regulators, we may lead into some challenges there. And then finally, I think there are possibilities to organize very big brands. If a consumer brand has a large enough footprint, then network fragmentation equals market fragmentation. And so there are definitely businesses where it is not profitable to divide and enrage or sort of feed the polarization. It'd be interesting to organize some of those largest businesses to actually in a collective form. And I think there's also possibilities to organize social influencers more to counteract misinformation. Collectively, influencers have incredible reach and in many cases credibility with their audiences. So I'll stop there. I'm over a minute. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. I'm going to pass the mic over to Kathleen. I think she also wants to show some slides.
Right. Okay, so it's great to be back in Cambridge, however, virtually, but I want to talk today about the technology underlying disinformation and the nature of disinformation and why there's a mismatch. In particular, we know that the various social media platforms have been designed in various ways that they provide these kind of features, such as the way their search engines work or the way they prioritize information. They have created a very fertile ground for bots or trolls, which are humans acting under pseudonyms and bashing groups, to actually share disinformation. And the way that they do that is much in the same ways that the gamers are currently using these same media to trash Wall Street or trash the stock market. What they're doing, these bots and trolls, is they're actually using these systems to create groups online to make people more join these groups, to build these more connections among these groups, and then to prime those groups so that they are ready for the disinformation when it comes. They put them in the like close to emotional state, then topple them over into emotions with excite messages and so on, and then get that and then seed in the disinformation. And then you just let your human cognition and your human social biases take it from there to spread the disinformation. So where you might think of disinformation spread and the technologies as it's all about what is being said, it's equally or more about the way the technologies allow and the creation of groups and the people to connect to others who are not necessarily people. So today, most disinformation, when people talk about disinformation, they often talk about it as though it's one thing. Oh, we get fact checkers and we're all done. Today, most fact checking is not done by is done by human beings, not by machines. It is a very tedious process. And one of the reasons it's hard is because the information is stored in so many different forms across so many platforms, much of which is not even online yet. And if you could build fact checkers, and as we are currently doing in computer science, in fact, you will be able to identify much of this disinformation and you could stop it. But as I'm showing you here, when we actually look at disinformation, there's over 25 different types of it. And inaccurate facts is the least of the problem. You know, other things such as doctored videos, these trolls, fake actors, doctored images, again, not as much of the problem. The harder problems are the fact that disinformation often takes the form of out of context information, as a form of conspiracies, as a form of unsupported opinion and anecdotes. If all disinformation looked like the megastorm picture, which occurs in every single natural disaster that has some kind of storm, you just plop your local landmark over the top, that wouldn't be a problem because that disinformation is caught very, very rapidly. Most people know it's fake, or they figure out it's fake within an hour and it dies within 2 days. The stuff like anti-vax, however, this takes longer and longer and is there much more, is there because not because it's being spread necessarily by direct calls to inaccurate facts, but it's being spread by stories such as, my girlfriend did not get her children vaccinated and they do not have autism. That's could be a 100% true fact, but it's irrelevant and has a flight of illogic in it. Okay. And finding those is much harder. Logical finders, finding illogic in statements is again something people are working on, but doing it at scale is extremely hard. Finally, disinformation is often spread in a way that can be thought of, if it's looked at differently, as satire. For example, the Russians are known to actually spread lots of disinformation, and when they're called on it, say, oh, we were just kidding, that was just satire. And the point is, satire, you can't tell if it's satire or not if it's completely out of context. And just looking at the information online, even human beings looking at it oftentimes go, is that true or is it a joke? I don't know. Was drink Corona beer a joke or was it true to get rid of COVID? So it's a very difficult situation. The other thing that makes stopping the spread of disinformation hard is the fact that most of the time, most disinformation is actually being spread by human beings. We find that particularly in the United States, people love disinformation. And when they find it, even if it's brought from other countries, it is rebroadcast like crazy by people in the US. Now, bots do play an important role. And in fact, what we find is that there's these little armies of bots around these disingenuous or fake news sites, and that they are responsible for retweeting out messages from those sites that are then picked up by humans who then spread them further. And that the more lethal the disinformation or the more conspiracy-like, the more there will be bots involved in spreading it. But those bots have been put there often by individuals and groups who are putting them there for a purpose. Disinformation itself is trendy. It changes what the kind of disinformation is, will change over the course of an event. As you see on the bottom, we see how it changed over the course of COVID-19. So when you talk about building a training set, for example, for a learning classifier to find disinformation, you say, I want it to be general purpose. Well, it's one of those things where you're always playing catch up because we're on to the next event with its own kind of disinformation before you've got your training set built. Influence campaigns in social media, which are trying to spread, of course, this disinformation, employ not just text, they also employ images. And we are getting better in technology at actually using what are called subliminal cue information, as well as social network techniques for identifying messages that are sent to create excitement in a group or dismay in a group, such as these, which are actually there to topple groups over into these emotionally charged units. The other thing that we're getting better at is identifying campaign patterns that are done in terms of social media. So for example, the Reopen America campaigns, what you do in these campaigns is that you insert bots and trolls around a polarizing issue on both sides, and you build more connections among people on both sides. Then you send out a happy message on one side and a sad message on the other side, excite and dismay, and that topples both groups over emotionally. Then you kept feeding them and you engage the leaders and support the leaders of the two groups. Okay, now this was done during the Reopen America campaigns, and it's also done by, they set up a whole bunch of new accounts. They joined both the pro-reopen and the anti-reopen. But the thing is, to spread the disinformation, the people spreading the disinformation, which was disinformation about things like the pandemic was fake, etc., they coordinated. They created a coordinated scheme where they were all linked together and timed their response and their information. And because they're timing out this information, it goes to the head of the list by most prioritization routines. Okay, and they ended up actually leading to these new pro-reopen ones. But don't think that's where it stopped. They actually sent other messages during the reopen campaigns to actually build links to the anti-face group, and the anti-vaccine group through My Body, My Right campaigns, actually using the pro-reopen campaigns to build an anti-COVID vaccination campaign through these same techniques. So in all, and you get more information at these sites, but I want to say that that even though we can't counter disinformation with facts, just sending out facts never stops anyone or changes their mind, because it's an emotional game. The other thing that's important to recognize about this is that you could use technology in principle to help support critical thinking. We teach critical thinking in schools. It does seem to help with helping people not recognize disinformation, but we don't know how to do it at scale. Nudging was mentioned earlier as a new technology, but the thing is, we found nudging to work very well in the lab. We don't know if it will work at scale for the whole population, because it will probably have the same problem that reminding people in California to duck under tables does, that say, yeah, earthquakes, yeah, I'm used to it. I can start ignoring you. And so they will get immune to the nudges after a while. You can use humor to counter disinformation, but again, this is very, very difficult to automate. The other thing you can do is you can force information itself and the images to carry a watermark that cannot be removed, that guarantees that it is made by and was generated, the person that claims it's from at the time that it was generated. That would require massive changes to the underlying infrastructure by which we share information. The other thing that technologists are talking about is working with policymakers to develop an internal algorithm service like the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, that is there to actually audit the platforms to see if the algorithms are really doing what they say they are doing. So there's a bunch of ways in which technology can come about, but one of the things that is important here to recognize is that technology designed to solve disinformation on a single platform or policies aimed at only a couple of platforms aren't going to work, because in fact, these platforms are so interlinked that when you actually stop disinformation on one platform or stop people on one platform, they simply move to another platform. We saw this with the QAnon, we saw this before with ISIS, and it's because of the interlinkages between all these platforms that you need a more widespread way of thinking about a uniform policy across them. So that's from the technology angle, what we can do. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Okay, with a slight room for breathing, I'm going to pass it over to Ethan.
Sure, and let me actually start by emphasizing a point that Kathleen made, which is just so important. It's really hard to understand what's going on in mis and disinformation without taking an ecosystem approach. We need to look not just at individual platforms, we need to look at how information moves between those platforms and how it moves between online spaces and mainstream media. And fortunately, it's becoming easier and easier to do that work. Sometimes it's platforms. Twitter, for instance, has made a huge step forward, opening up its research API to a much larger set of researchers. That's going to make it a lot easier to look at the flow of information between Twitter and mainstream media, which is really great news. I want to try to make 3 big points here. The first is just sort of an observation on what's been going on in terms of how the platforms are thinking about their role in governing speech. Danny gave a wonderful overview at the beginning, talking about this very strong free speech background that we have to understand the platforms in terms of. People who govern these platforms really see themselves as defenders of free speech and trying to allow as many voices as possible. But we've seen in the last few years that that's increasingly untenable. We're seeing more incitement to violence, more hate, more harassment of individuals. And what I'm starting to see in the last really year or two is a shift to more of what you might think of as a public health theory. Where people who are managing the platforms are saying, look, speech in some cases may be so dangerous, it may be so bad for the health of the community that we're going to go get out in front of it. And we might be much more aggressive in policing mis and disinformation than we were previously. I don't think Donald Trump is the first example of this. I actually think the first time I saw this really working very effectively was around COVID-19 and the pandemic video. This was a really powerful piece of viral disinformation. It worked very, very hard to blame COVID-19 on people who were trying to fight COVID-19. It gave terrible health advice. And the platforms actually were very aggressive about taking it down. It came down off of Facebook and YouTube within about 48 hours, and it probably limited the damage significantly. I think this willingness to think more in terms of public health, to think about, is speech damaging free and fair elections? Is it suppressing the vote? Is it inciting people to violence? I think this is a trend that we are seeing platforms be more willing to take on. This stance of we are neutral, we're going to promote speech, and that's our primary value, I think is now turning into a position of we recognize that the health of public conversation is of public interest, and we may be willing to take more action on that front. Let me say, I don't know that that's the best solution. As Danny pointed out, we ended up in a situation where people did not want strong government control over speech in online spaces. And I think a lot of people are rightly concerned that having, whether it's Jack Dorsey or Mark Zuckerberg or anybody else, with strong control over speech in online spaces, that is a less than optimal situation. Second thing I want to say is, despite the fact that there's a lot of brilliant work being done on mis and disinformation, some in Deb's lab on understanding how disinformation actually spreads, the wonderful work that Kathleen is doing, many, many other people in this field, I think we are making a mistake in trying to solve mis and disinformation purely as a technological problem. I do not think that there is a purely technical solution to some of the problems that we have around mis and disinformation at the moment. I would point out that at the moment, 70% of polled Republican voters believe that the 2020 election was stolen. They believe this in no small part because the leader of their party insisted that it was, and 147 elected representatives and senators voted to overturn a Democratic election. At that point, it's not just a matter of people not checking their sources of information. You have people in real positions of power spreading information that is simply untrue. And right now, we have a mis and disinformation problem, but I don't know that it's really about deep fakes or even about armies of bots spreading poor information. I think we have a political problem in which one political party is promoting an alternative version of reality. And I think at that point, our informational tools are actually pretty limited in figuring out how to restrain that information. We have to make a political decision that we actually want to hold on to a fact-based reality. And so there have to be some consequences for embracing this alternative reality. And those are going to have to unfold in the political realm, not purely in the technological realm. Third point I'd like to make. I think there's amazing efforts going on right now to help existing platforms do a better job. I look at my friends Eli Pariser and Talia Stroud with the Civic Signals Project. They are trying to figure out how platforms could identify pro-civic speech and amplify it. Kathleen made reference to various different projects that are trying to audit algorithms and figure out whether they are fair. I think Julia Ongwin over at The Markup is doing wonderful work on this. I think you may see moves during the Biden administration towards some sort of public body to audit algorithms and try to make sure that they are not showing a structural bias, racism, sexism, et cetera, et cetera. I think, however, that we are probably making a mistake in overemphasizing fixing the platforms that we have right now. The work that I'm trying to do over at UMass essentially has as its flag the Facebook hand holding a wrench with an X through it. I want to stop fixing Facebook. And what I actually want to do instead is think about this model that we've gotten into of very large, very powerful platforms which moderate themselves and treat speech moderation as a cost center. Whether you're on YouTube, whether you're on Facebook, whether you're on Twitter, moderation is really a problem that has to be solved. If it can be solved by outsourcing it or solved with AI, that's a preferable way to do it. I actually think we need to take control over our own conversations. And I would love to see us move towards a vision of social media with interoperable platforms that are much, much smaller. I've been using the argument 20 to 20,000 people, and where the people who use those platforms are also responsible for the governance of those platforms. I think we've made a terrible mistake in allowing control of speech to become a business function, and essentially said, let's outsource this to whoever can do this as cheaply as possible. These are the real small d democratic conversations that we need to have about the future. And I think the sort of healthy conversations that Deb is trying to bring out of his new center, I think in many cases, they may actually come out of having people who share an online space together debate about what is acceptable behavior and how we deal with behavior that is not acceptable. So I'll put that out there as a provocation. Thrilled to be part of this conversation, and it's wonderful to be with y'all.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Ethan and Deb and Kathleen. Three very, very interesting perspectives on the problem. A lot of discussion here around platform responsibilities, personal responsibility, and its relationship to democracy. It made me want to ask my first question to Deb, which is, could you tell us more about your new center and where you think it has intersectionality with the issues of disinformation?
Sure. So we, just a couple of weeks ago, MIT announced the Center for Constructive Communication. And the center today is about 30 people, and we're doing three things. One, continuing our work in analyzing social media and media ecosystems, looking at structure and fragmentation of networks, excuse me, and spread of information. And then leveraging those analytics to design tools and methods for influencers and for organizations who are interested in working towards more constructive and healthy public dialogue. And I can give you examples of that. And then the third, which maybe is closest aligned to what Ethan is calling for, we're also assuming that in 5 or 10 years from today, the platforms, the social media platforms that are dominant today will not maintain their dominance. And they may still be here, but some of the functions which we're right now using, doing the best we can with the tools we have, may shift. It may also be that we're going to have a much larger number of platforms. So with that in mind and a longer view, we are working with various external partners to co-design and pilot new concepts for, and it's not that necessarily our work will lead to one of those next new platforms, but a place where we can incubate and try out ideas. So Local Voices Network is an example, which actually, together with Cortico, a nonprofit, is an example of bringing facilitated dialogue and technology together to build a scalable platform that brings voice and stories into public dialogue. And we're working also in the design phase of a pro-social media platform for young teens, for kids. And that's something we'll start piloting hopefully later this year.
Any reactions to that from the other panelists?
I guess I'll just make a connective and then is that, when we talk about the platforms today, there is, and moderation in particular, a kind of brief history of many of the platforms is that the norms of behavior were unclear when the platforms went into motion. And so naturally, people who are capable of all sorts of behaviors started expressing them. Some of the problems that Ethan and Kathleen highlighted are amplified in new ways because of the affordance of the platforms. The human armies that got rolled out, their primary function was to moderate. And so what if instead we conceive of new platforms which take a human first approach, and rather than the focus being on moderation, the role of people that make up the platform focus on facilitation or elevation of underheard perspectives. And it's not that we don't need moderation and we don't need authentication of identity and so forth, but we could start with not just a different set of norms for user behavior, but also the role of people, and to not make the mistake that these platforms are purely technological. They are not today, they will not be in the future.
Deb, one of the things about that idea is that I think you actually need to have a goal in mind, right? I think part of what happened was these platforms came about and people didn't really know what they were going to be used for. Facebook certainly had an initial motivation of creating connectivity within a college campus, but that expanded very quickly. Twitter sort of legendarily was just this sort of status and check-in system, and then it metastasized very, very quickly. I think when we start thinking about that question of what would we want a moderator to do, we actually have to have a certain goal for the network. And I think the minimum goal should be that people feel safe there, they feel like they can express themselves there. I think in many cases, we're going to get into interesting directions by having much more explicit goals. I am doing a lot of work right now about thinking about how do you build networks to make better neighbors? How do you build networks to make better citizens? How do you build networks that help people find cognitive diversity and more diverse points of view? And I actually think having a goal to the network makes that sort of moderation work that you're talking about more possible. Because we're talking about this within a policy environment, I think one of the things that I want to suggest is, as projects like yours are trying to create new networks, I think we're all going to discover that compatibility and the ability to interact between networks, to move between them, is going to be utterly critical. There's a long list of alternative social networks that sort of started up and died very quickly, because it's actually very hard to say to people, abandon all your friends, abandon all your contacts, come hang out with me here. It works for one very small group of people, which are people who get deplatformed, right? So when all the Nazis get kicked off of Twitter and move on to Gab, that works just fine for them. But the danger is if we keep going down that pathway, we end up with the Nazis inventing the next generation of social media. My guess is that what we want are people who can interact with Facebook, interact with Twitter, but also step into one of these special purpose spaces that's working on citizenship or that's working on healthy conversation, that's a place where we could use a lot of help on policy. Right now, it's very challenging to build systems that allow interoperation between different social networks. Most of the APIs don't allow for it. There is settled case law that's actually very challenging. The Ninth Circuit settled a decision in a case called Facebook versus Power Ventures, which makes it really difficult to build a third-party client to use a system like Facebook. The truth is, I think one of the ways that we build the future of social networks is by building something that allows you to use Facebook and Twitter, but also use Deb's new social network and the new social networks that I'm trying to build, which means you need some sort of policy environment that mandates that form of interoperability. And so that's one of the areas where I worry that policy is often looking at things like monopoly. Can we break up Facebook into its component parts? I actually think in many cases that's much less important than creating an environment that will make it possible for people to start novel social networks and have them have a much better chance of succeeding within this environment.
Kind of like a phone number. There was a time when the networks asserted that you could not have interoperability, and it's kind of hard to understand the argument today because a phone number can be reused.
The argument was that it would break everything, right? It was the argument against the answering machine as well, right? If we allow third parties to interconnect with our system, we will not have reliability anymore. It's not an argument that works real well in the internet age, because honestly, that's what TCP/IP was engineered for. It was engineered to allow enormous interoperability and permissionless innovation. We've now moved into a world that is much more constrained, where Facebook can sort of say you can only interact with Facebook through the Facebook client. That is something that we really need to move away from to look at more diverse and inclusive visions of social networks going forward.
So Ethan, in your approach, you would need not only a shared namespace, but also some set of shared verbs, actions that,
That's right.
Right, that could be interoperable. And then obviously each platform you can think of as a different medium with its own mediating characteristics. So there'd be all sorts of things that are different, but there'd be a need also by policy perhaps to have, or maybe this is, but there's the verbs, the actions shared in the television networks, but they're not in the social networks.
Right. So Deb, one of the projects that I was working on over at Center for Civic Media, over at the Media Lab, was gobo.social. And this was a piece of software that allowed you to read from and post to Twitter, Facebook, and Mastodon simultaneously. And it turns out that the verbs for Twitter and for Facebook are pretty similar. You post, you like, or you upvote. There's ways to sort of deal with that. The obstacles, I think, are not so much technical, they're legal, right? Facebook basically said, you cannot engage with posts. You can only engage with pages. You can only deal with the publicly world readable stuff here. You can't deal with the stuff that is only readable by you as a logged in user. The next version of this, we may go ahead and cache people's credentials or use some sort of authorization token to make it possible for someone to take posts from their friends and put it into a client like Gobo and be able to interact with them. And there's a decent chance that we will be challenged by Facebook for doing that. But this is where I think we have to start using some combination of proposing policy or potentially taking this into the courts to find a way to make this form of innovation possible. But let me bring this over to Kathleen. Kathleen, you're doing this really important work, sort of figuring out how people are abusing these systems, how people sort of come into them adversarially. You've got Deb and me here both trying to create new social networks. Are we just going to make your life more miserable and difficult? You need to unmute.
Unmute, please.
Kathleen, you're muted.
The one thing we know from the sociology science is that no matter what new technologies come out, people will use them in unforeseen ways. And so you won't make my life necessarily more difficult. You will make it different. And no matter how great your technology is, no matter how great your policies are, people will find ways to get around them and to engage in some kind of behavior you might not want them to engage in. And so what's missing from these pure technology or pure policy solutions is changing human norms and beliefs about their own role in information and their own role in how they should think about information in general, like the truth value they have and how they want to think about governance in general. And so we need to work on that thing at the same time.
So I'm going to turn over some of the questions to the audience so they can participate more actively. And I've got lots of great questions in the buffer. And so I'm trying to pick out a few. Here's one. Many have talked about more required moderation as a partial solution for new social networks. How might we balance pricing out young and underfunded competitors like Parler, because moderation costs are so high, and accidentally creating a monopoly with the status quo networks, as they are the only ones who can actually afford moderation?
I'd argue that's the wrong way to think about moderation.
Yeah.
That's thinking about moderation as a cost center.
Yeah.
People try to create networks and they try to figure out how to spend as little money on moderation as possible. I actually think we should probably be building networks, and I actually think the question of how they're governed and moderated should be the first question you start with, not the technology, not what you're sharing back and forth. I think there's an enormous amount of social science research that we need to do on how to moderate effectively. I look at someone like Nathan Matthias's work, where he's actually doing studies over at Cornell about how moderators can be more effective in different subreddits as sort of a pioneer in that space. But I think we have to get rid of that paradigm that moderation is a cost. Moderation is the heart of what makes a social network work.
Thank you. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
I do think that moderation is overemphasized. Again, just to repeat a point I made earlier, if you create a communication space with underspecified norms and, to Ethan's point, a kind of purpose, then it's predictable that anything goes, anything will go. And now you have to spend a lot of time tamping out bad behavior. Moderation is really focusing on suppressing. What about facilitation? What are the elevators who elevate the voices that are feeling a little shy, the introspective and the quiet, spaces where more nuance and complexity can flow? So I think there's many different human functions. Moderation is just one. We tend to focus on them because we have created these under-specified norms that allow bad behavior to flourish. So it's not that it's not important, but it's not the only, and in my opinion, not the most important function we should be focused on as we think about networks of the future.
Yeah, and content moderation can actually backfire. So they have actually found that if you remove posts and moderate certain key leaders, it only makes the stuff go underground, and then it spreads even faster and more virally. So it can actually backfire. China uses content moderation all the time but they don't actually wipe out information. They just lower it to an acceptable level of dissent, so that there is so that it's almost like diffusing the angst, because they still allow it to be there, but at a certain level.
Oh, that's really interesting. I'm going to go to another question. One difference between phones and social media is the difference between one-to-one connections versus broadcasting. Would interoperability prevent Twitter from deplatforming harmful users? For example, Trump inciting violence. And if so, is that good? Or if not, what might that look like? Who wants to bite that one off?
There's already difficulties with deplatforming Trump. And one of the things that Twitter did is Twitter is now making it difficult for Trump to reach those users he already had on Twitter. The truth is, there's lots of other places to go. From Gab, which was begging Trump to move over from day one, to the possibility of starting his own Mastodon node and starting his own network there. I think one of the things to remember is that the ultimate interoperable system that we have is the World Wide Web, and that there's enormous amounts of hateful speech on it already. Stormfront, the legendarily awful neo-Nazi bulletin board, is alive and well. Mm-hmm. And with a little bit of creative searching, you can find your way there. The benefit of it is that you know what you're getting. You sort of know that you're going into an explicitly hateful white nationalist space. I think part of what has been so dangerous about the contemporary media environment is that no one knows what the rules are. Sort of as Deb was saying, you might be joining a space because you're hoping to have a conversation with your high school friends on Facebook, and someone else is using it as a space to recruit you to the QAnon conspiracy. And, you know, those sort of cross purposes make that space really confusing and really dangerous. My guess is that deplatforming, in addition to possibly making movements more underground and more radicalized, it makes it more likely that when you're encountering that content, that was the content you were looking for. And I think that may diffuse some of the power of extreme speech to sort of draw new people into its orbit.
Well, one of the things, though, that's made things very dangerous in the current environment has been the fact that you don't have to provide accurate credentials of who you are when you're speaking, so that people have been shown to be interacting with an account. They think it's their friend Jill, but actually it's someone else who's taken over Jill's account and sending out information through it to her. And so this tactic was actually used to build bridges between different groups in the 2016, 2018, 2020 election, and internationally in all the elections in Western Europe, to actually build connections between like the conservatives and the Christian conservatives and these groups together, just by making it look like someone who it really wasn't.
I was just going to add that I think it's a great question. And how does the if you go back to this idea of a social broadcast network, and the idea of interoperability from a broadcaster view, I think it's more than just the 88 million followers that Trump had when he was on the platform that sort of have to be taken into account for this question. That's, of course, the most direct way in which a broadcaster has their audience, is the number of followers. But there is all of the other content which creates the media experience of being on Twitter, that creates a network effect that just having interoperability does not give you a clear exit route. So kind of how that works and how the idea of interoperability interacts with broadcast sort of sources in particular, I think it's really actually it's a great question that points at some other advantages that a network that gets enough scale will hold, even when there's interoperability. So I think it's a great question.
So unfortunately, I have to shut this show down. Not the whole show, but the panel down. And I just want to end by thanking all the panelists. It was a most stimulating discussion. And I think the audience shares with me this great gratitude for you bringing your insights into this. And so I'm going to, at this point, thank you and pass control over to Danny for the next panel.
All right. Well,